Morning, everybody. So in this video, we'll talk about gross revenue versus net income, and a lot of people don't really understand the definition of these two terms. So let's start with gross revenue. Gross revenue is the totality of all your earnings for the year. They could include things like a bonus. They include fuel surcharge. They include um, your total revenue per mile, all combined, everything combined. That's your gross revenue. Net income is what's left after you pay your truck payments, your health insurance, because now you're self-employed, you got to pay for your own health insurance. You pay for all your own maintenance. You pay for all your own accessories. You pay for your own fuel, and then net income is what's less. So gross revenue by definition, will always be greater than net income. And a lot of times people like to focus on the gross revenue, but really what should be asking is what's the net income? Because the net income is what actually goes into your checking account, not gross revenue. So for an owner operator, at least on a big box carrier, it's not uncommon to have a gross revenue of about $200,000 per year. Now we're going to paint in broad brushes, so um, it could be more, could be less, and there's some variation there from carrier to carrier and from driver to driver, but on average, they should be able to get $200,000 per year gross revenue as of today's date, April of 2025. So that sounds great, $200,000 a year, and you're like, wow, company drivers. I mean, they just go bananas. They hear that, they're like, I got to become an owner operator. Well, hold your horses, because that's you don't get to keep that money, and many times you don't even see that money. So let's talk about some of these deductions. Um, let's say, for example, you have a newer used truck, but your truck payment is $3,000 per month. Well, in $3,000 per month, that's those 12 months, $36,000. So we take 200,000 minus 36,000. Crap. Now we just lost a big chunk of that gross revenue. Now we're down to 164,000. Okay. Now minus 25,000 for the year for maintenance. You know, now we're down to 140,000. Now this minus another $12,000 a year for your own health insurance. You know, you see where we're just chipping away at that. We're now at probably closer to $125,000 per year. Okay, and did we talk about buying fuel? Fuel could be $50,000 per year. Could be less, but probably around $50,000 per year. So now we're getting to the point where we're less than $100,000 per year. It's like, well, I thought this was going to be a great opportunity. Well, for some people it is, but not for everybody. And by the time, and then you got to pay 25% taxes on that net income. So let's just say, for example, after all your expenses, you came in at $100,000 per year net income. And then you got to pay 25% taxes, because now you got to pay your own taxes. You got to pay your own Social Security, you got to pay your own Medicare, and then you got to pay, which is like 15%, and then you got to pay 10% federal income tax. So now 25% of 100, now you're down to $75,000 for the year. It's like, well, crap, for that much money, I might as well stay as a company driver. So that's a possibility. And then if you are unfortunate, say you have an old truck that breaks down all the time, you could actually make less than a company driver. If you have a bad year, you can make less than a company driver. So it's something you have to give some thought to. If you're a company driver, and let's say, for example, you're a senior company driver, because the more senior you are, the more money you're going to make per mile. Here at Crete, For example, they often boast that the top 50% of their drivers make over $110,000 per year. It's like, that's amazing. Walmart pays very, very well, extremely well. I think Walmart pays the highest for a company driver in the industry. So it's not uncommon to say that company drivers who are experienced can do just as good as owner operators. And it's like, well, why would someone even want to become an owner operator? Well, why do like some people like ketchup and other people like mustard? Does it really matter? Um, can you be successful either way? Can you be successful as a company driver? Yeah, you can. There's company drivers who retire as a millionaire. Can you be successful as an owner operator? Yes, you can. You know, which one is more successful? Well, that depends on the individual. Because as an owner operator, it depends on how hard you're willing to work at it. It's if you if you're going to drive less miles because you're an owner operator, you're not going to make as much money as a company driver. So it depends on how hard you want to work at it. Um, an owner operator can and typically does make more money than a company driver, but not in all cases. So it's something you have to give thought to, and it's the reason why a lot of senior company drivers don't want to become owner operators because they're fat and happy. They're at top of the pay scale at their company, and they get a probably a brand new truck every 3 or 4 years. Why would they want to go buy a used old truck with 400,000 miles and make about the same, or if they're if they're having a good year, or make less if they're having a bad year? So I know a lot of company drivers want to become owner operators, and I'm not here to rain on anyone's parade, but you should be aware that you can be successful as a company driver. Don't think of owner operators as your path to success, as your only path to success. That's not true. There's many guys who are successful who are company drivers. Some of my best trucking buddies are company drivers, and company drivers have helped me out as an owner operator. There's been times when my truck broke down and I'm stranded in middle of nowhere, Wyoming, and a company driver is willing to give me a ride for 200 miles so I can get back to a terminal location while my truck is being repaired. So uh, they can be very, very helpful. I was stuck one time, and I made a mistake of trying to cross a cement barrier on an angle. I ended up getting my drive axles hung up in the air, had no traction. Well, it was a company driver came along with a chain, pulled me off of it. So there, there's nothing wrong with being a company driver. And some of those guys are just as smart, just as capable, just as good a driver, maybe even better drivers than owner operators. They just prefer to be a company driver. So let's get into some more numbers here for owner operators. So here at Crete, they use a sliding pay scale. We won't go into great detail on that, but if I take my gross revenue divided by the number of miles I drive, then my gross revenue per mile is generally around $1.75 per mile. You're like, oh, that's not too good. Yeah, but then I get all the discounts on top of that. That's where the real value comes in. It's all the Crete discounts I get on top of that. That could be worth an additional 25 cents per mile. So I only see $1.75, but in actuality, I realize closer to $2 per mile. And if we compare that to the dry van rate on the spot market, and I posted a link in the description, currently it's in some parts of the country it's below $2 per mile. In other parts of the country it's slightly above $2 per mile. So the Crete rate is very, very competitive, very competitive. If you're in reefer, it's going to pay more. Flatbed will pay more. But I'm in dry van, so we're only talking about dry van. So, a lot of times when the spot market, the rates go up, the rates go down. Sometimes they do better than the contract freight guys do, who are leased on with a big box carrier like I am. We're 1099 independent contractors. If you were on a spot market, like during the pandemic, the rates went up to over $3 per mile. Sometimes it was $4 per mile. So they were making money hand over fist. But then afterwards, the rates crashed, and then it was below $2 per mile. And then they were crying the blues. They were down in the doldrums. And a lot of times when it happens, when the spot market rate gets below $2 per mile, these guys come off the spot market and they join the big box carrier for 6 months to a year until the rates improve, and then they'll go back with their own authority onto the spot market. So it's something that, as you're learning about being an owner operator, this really applies to company drivers who are thinking about becoming owner operators. These are the terminology that's thrown around all the time that you should become familiar with. It's like, what is gross revenue? What is net income? And then you think about what your potential earnings will be. That may affect your decision on whether to buy, a truck with lower miles or a truck with higher miles. A lot of times you'll see owner operators with the nastiest, oldest trucks. And the reason that is because the truck's paid for. They can get a greater net income because now, they're not making monthly truck payments. But they take the risk of having breakdowns, and stuff like that. Poor customer service because they're not able to deliver the load consistently. So a lot of times you'd see on the spot market, a lot of ratty looking old trucks. I mean, it's like, how does that thing even pass a DOT inspection? But somehow, some way, they're able to do it, and they're struggling to make ends meet. If they go buy a newer piece of equipment, then that's going to lower their net income. So it's something you got to give a lot of thought to. It's like, talk to a lot of drivers, talk to a lot of company drivers, talk to a lot of owner operators. What I've seen over the years is that the owner operator business model appeals to younger drivers or guys with less than, typically less than 5 years driving experience. Because as a company driver, they're on the bottom of the totem pole on the pay scale, and they can maximize their earning potential by becoming an owner operator. They don't have to wait 10 or 15 years to get paid a living wage. They go from making something like 45 cents per mile to making $1 per mile. That's huge. It's huge. It's a huge opportunity for them. They would have to wait a decade, to get anywhere near that as a company driver. And the other thing is, company drivers don't get paid $1 per mile. They get paid, say, 60, 63 or 65 cents per mile, as of today's date. So where are they making up this difference to where they're comparable to owner operators? Well, the company does a discretionary profit sharing plan at the end of the year. And it could be 30 grand or more that they put into their 401ks. See, the owner operators don't get that, so, but we get it throughout the year, whereas they get it at the end of the year. We get it at as part of our pay settlement. We spend it on anything we want. They get it as a 401k contribution. They can't touch it until they retire. So yeah, they can make as much money as owner operators, but how they're being paid is completely different. So you gotta give that some thought too. If you're good at investing, you may not want to put your money in a 401k. You're like, look, I could do better on my own with having an individual brokerage account or an IRA. So these are all things that go into the decision-making process, whether you want to stay as a company driver or you want to take on some risk and become an owner operator. Without no risk, there's no reward. So it's not guaranteed as an owner operator that you're going to be successful. Many have tried, many have failed. Many have tried again, and many have failed again. So not everyone has the skill sets to become successful as an owner operator. And even if you are successful as owner operator, you could have bad luck. You could have bad years. You could have years that you didn't make any money. You just broke even because of truck repairs and things like that. So these are things that you have to be willing to accept as possibilities if you want to become an owner operator. If you're looking for guaranteed money, then stay as a company driver. You're guaranteed. There's very low risk there. But you know, if you're willing to take on some risk, there's great opportunities, but there's no guarantees. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the internet.